Well, today we begin the book of Judges. And if you've been in the church for any length of time, you're probably familiar with many of the stories of Judges. Stories of brave warriors who fought to deliver God's people from their enemies. People like Ehud, the left-handed warrior who lost his sword in the belly of the king of Moab. Deborah, the prophetess, who led the armies of Israel and delivered them from the Canaanites. Gideon, who trusted the Lord to defeat the mighty Midianite army of more than 100,000 soldiers when Gideon himself only had 300. And Samson, the strongest man in the world. But don't make the mistake of thinking that Judges is a collection of stories about great heroes. It's actually a sad story of the persistent disobedience and rebelliousness and sinfulness of God's people. But it's also an amazing picture of the relentless patience and mercy of God. So here's what was going on. Joshua, their great leader, had died. And for a while, Israel continued to be faithful to obey the Lord. They drove out the Canaanites and others from the land that he had given them. But then Israel failed to finish the job, and they began to make agreements and covenants with the people and allowed some of them to stay in the land. And then at the beginning of chapter 2, the angel of the Lord comes to them, and he says, "You have not obeyed me. You have made a covenant with the peoples of these lands, and now this is what's going to happen. The people and their gods are going to be a constant thorn in your side. They are going to be a trap that will get you and lead you into all kinds of sin." And that's exactly what happens. It says in verse 10 of chapter 2 that after Joshua's generation was gone, another generation arose who did not know the Lord. How could that happen? I can only imagine that it was because the fathers were so busy fighting their enemies when they entered the land that they didn't take the time to actually teach their children the ways of the Lord. And when we fail to do that, the results are tragic. Look what happens, the very next verse, Judges 2, verse 11. "And the sons of Israel did evil in the sight of the Lord, and they started to follow the gods of the people around them." We've been saying all along that when God's people forget who God is, when they fail to acknowledge God as God, it leads to all kinds of wickedness and chaos. And throughout Judges, we see that to be true, as God's people live in an ongoing cycle of disobedience, despair, and deliverance. This is how it goes. Israel turns away from the Lord, and they worship other gods. In response, God hands them over to some enemy who oppresses them. After a time, Israel eventually cries out to the Lord to save them. In His mercy, God sends a judge, and He delivers them. But then after some time of peace, Israel turns to other gods, and the Lord hands them over to an enemy who oppresses them for a while. And Israel eventually cries out to the Lord for help, and God, in His mercy, sends a judge to deliver them. But after a time of peace, Israel starts to worship other gods again. And the cycle goes on and on and on. In fact, it went on like that for hundreds of years. And not only that, that was the story of Israel throughout the Old Testament. And quite often, that's also the story of God's people in the New Testament. And way too often, it's the story in the lives of God's people today. Think about it. We walk with God, but then when everything's going really well, it's so easy to forget and to be distracted and to have our hearts and minds drawn away to turn our focus onto other things that we love and trust. Even as God's people, we so often prove to be habitually faithless. But the beauty of the gospel, the beauty of the story of God, the beauty of the story of our lives is that in all of that, through all of that, God remains rich in mercy, perfectly loving, infinitely patient, and He is and forever will be eternally faithful.